My name is Amelia Vance, and I was 31 years old when my mother stood beneath a gold banner at Rosehaven Senior Center and told 84 people I was not disabled. She did it with a microphone in her hand, pearls at her throat, and a photographer waiting near the cake table to capture the moment she became Community Caregiver of the Year. The room smelled like coffee, floor wax, and white lilies. Donors sat at the front tables. Church ladies filled the middle rows. A reporter from the county paper stood near the back wall, pen ready, smiling like she had come to write a soft story about a good woman who spent her life helping the vulnerable. Then my mother looked straight at me. "My daughter has been using that chair to punish this family," she said. The room went still in that strange, polite way rooms go still when cruelty arrives dressed as concern. My brother Callum lowered his eyes. My father stared into his water glass. Nobody moved toward me. Nobody asked if I was okay. I sat near the side aisle with my hands resting on the cold metal rims of my wheelchair, the same way I had taught myself to sit whenever my family tried to make me smaller. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I had spent 28 months learning that anger only gave my mother something to point at. She stepped down from the small stage and leaned close enough for me to smell her rose perfume. "Don't make me bring your medical history into this room," she whispered. I looked at her pearls, then at the double doors behind her. "You already did, Mom," I said. That was when the doors opened, and my attorney walked in beside Detective Grace Mallory, carrying the secret hospital file my mother thought she had buried forever. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. Before that door opened, before my mother's smile changed in front of people who had trusted her for years, I lived in a quiet, ground-floor rental condo 20 minutes from Rosehaven. It was not the kind of place my family would ever mention with pride. Beige siding. A narrow strip of grass. A maple tree by the parking lot that dropped red leaves across the ramp every October. But it was mine. Every shelf in my kitchen sat low enough for me to reach. The hallway was wide. My coffee mugs hung from hooks under the cabinet. The bathroom had grab bars installed after I argued with the landlord for 6 months and finally sent him the accessibility code highlighted in yellow. There was nothing elegant about most of it, but every inch of that place had been arranged around one promise. I would not have to call my mother when I needed to live my own life. Before the accident, I worked as an occupational therapy assistant at a rehab facility outside Lancaster. I spent my days helping older patients relearn the small things nobody thinks about until a body stops cooperating. How to button a shirt with one working hand. How to step into a shower without panic. How to move from a hospital bed to a chair without feeling like a child in front of your own family. I was good at that work because I paid attention. I noticed when pride hurt worse than a broken hip. I noticed when a grown man made jokes because he was terrified. I noticed when adult children spoke over their parents and called it love. After the accident, I became the person people spoke over. My legs did not answer me anymore. My body had rules I had not agreed to. Some mornings, getting from bed to bathroom felt like negotiating with a stranger who had moved into my skin. Still, I learned. I adapted. I built routines. I started consulting from home, reviewing houses and small offices for accessibility, writing reports about ramps, door widths, bathroom layouts, and the quiet humiliations hidden in bad design. Strangers paid me to understand disability. My own mother called it obsession. "You're not as helpless as you want people to think," she would say, her voice smooth enough to pass for concern. Callum had his own version. "You'd recover faster if you stopped making this your whole identity." My father, Vernon, said almost nothing. Silence was his safest room. That was how my family survived the truth. They renamed it until no one had to feel guilty. And the night of the accident, they did the same thing before I even woke up. The night of the accident was a Thursday in February, the kind of wet Pennsylvania night that makes every road look darker than it is. I had left the Harbor House winter fundraiser a little after 9. My mother had spent the evening moving from donor to donor, with her hand resting lightly on someone's sleeve, laughing softly, collecting praise the way some women collect silver. Callum had given a speech about dignity for seniors and community responsibility, and people clapped like he had personally invented kindness. I remember walking to my car under the parking lot lights, tired but steady. Near the service entrance sat a black Lincoln Navigator with its engine running. The windows were too dark to see inside, but I knew the vehicle. It belonged to Harbor House, and Callum liked standing close to important things, even when they were not his. The rain was light, not a storm, just enough to turn the road slick and make the yellow lines shine. I was 10 minutes from home when headlights rose behind me, too high, too close. At first, I thought the driver would pass. Then the Navigator came up on my left near the East Service Road, crowding my lane like I was an inconvenience it expected to move. I hit the horn. One long sound. My hands tightened on the wheel. The SUV drifted closer. There was no time for a speech, no time for fear to become dramatic. Just light, metal, the hard pull of the shoulder, and the terrible understanding that someone else had decided where my car was going. After that, my memory comes in pieces. Rain on glass, a voice asking my name, the smell of plastic and cold air, my own mouth trying to form the same sentence over and over. There was a black SUV. I said it in the ambulance. I said it in the emergency room. Nora Bellamy would tell me later that I said it before my mother arrived, before Callum arrived, before anyone had a chance to explain me away. But by the time I woke up days later, the official story had already been dressed, pressed, and handed to everyone who mattered. Single vehicle loss of control, possible medication, confusion. No confirmed second vehicle. My mother sat beside my hospital bed with perfect hair and tired eyes. Vernon stood near the window, holding a paper cup of coffee he never drank. Callum stayed at the foot of the bed, looking solemn in the way people do when they want credit for being present. "You lost control," my mother said gently. I tried to tell her again. The SUV, the headlights, the service road. She touched my hand like I was a frightened child. "Sweetheart," she said, "trauma makes people invent details." That was the first time she took the truth from me and called it healing. That was the part of my mother people never understood. Marjorie Vance did not look like a woman who could erase her own daughter. She looked like the woman who brought casseroles before anyone asked, who remembered which widower took his coffee black, who kept extra sympathy cards in the glove box of her car. At church, she knew when to lower her voice and when to place a hand over her heart. At Harbor House, she could speak about dignity and aging with tears shining perfectly in her eyes, and people believed every word because believing her made the world feel decent. Before she retired, my mother had been a hospital records supervisor for almost 25 years. She knew where a chart went after midnight. She knew which notes mattered, and which ones disappeared under language nobody read. She knew the difference between an error and an amendment, between a locked file and one that only looked locked to people who did not understand the system. She also knew which old logins should have been disabled and which friendships still opened doors after retirement. When I was younger, I thought that made her important. After the accident, I understood it made her dangerous. At home, Marjorie did not need a microphone. She controlled a room with pauses. If I cried as a child, she would say, "Don't perform." If I disagreed, she would tilt her head and ask why I always had to make simple things unpleasant. If Callum broke something, he was overwhelmed. If I objected to cleaning it up, I was difficult. Callum learned early that being my mother's favorite came with protection and applause. He was praised for potential before he earned anything. Student council, business degree, young leadership panels. Every ordinary step he took was framed like evidence of destiny. Mine were treated like noise, unless my mother could use them in one of her stories about perseverance. Vernon watched from the edge of every room. My father was not cruel in the sharp way she was. He simply disappeared whenever truth required effort. He folded napkins, washed glasses, Checked the thermostat. A quiet man can still help build a cage. He just does it without leaving fingerprints. 6 weeks after the accident, when I finally came home from inpatient rehab, my mother arranged the living room like a visitor center. Flowers on the side table, a throw blanket across my lap, lemon water within reach. Then she invited 3 women from church over and told them I was adjusting beautifully. I sat there listening while she turned my injury into her testimony. That was Marjorie's gift. She could make herself the hero of pain she had not survived. I did not know it then, but the first document that proved it would arrive in an envelope I almost threw away. The envelope came on a Tuesday, folded into my mailbox between a grocery flyer and a postcard from a dentist I had never visited. I almost tossed it with the rest because the logo belonged to my insurance company, and by then I had learned what those envelopes usually meant. No, not covered. Try again later. This one was about a pressure relief cushion my doctor had recommended after a skin breakdown scare that frightened me more than I admitted to anyone. The denial was polite, printed in gray ink, full of phrases that sounded reasonable if you did not have to live inside the body being denied. I read it at my kitchen table with a pen in my hand, because that was how I had learned to survive paperwork. Slowly. Line by line. The company claimed the cushion was not medically necessary under the current documentation, which would have been ordinary enough to make me angry and nothing more. But near the bottom, under the appeal instructions, there was one sentence I read 3 times. To appeal this decision, you may request the complete claim record, including all medical, billing, diagnostic, and incident documentation used in review. Complete claim record. I sat back and looked at those 3 words until the refrigerator clicked on and startled me. For 28 months, my mother had stood between me and my own record, like a locked door in sensible shoes. Doctors spoke around me. Family members corrected me. Reports appeared already summarized, already cleaned, already certain. But this letter, cold and faceless as it was, said something my family never had. The records belonged to me. I was not a lawyer, but I knew enough about forms to know that vague requests disappear and specific ones get answered. I filed the request that afternoon. Not emotionally, not dramatically. I wrote it the way I used to write patient notes, exact and boring enough to be dangerous. I asked for the full claim record, the hospital billing detail, diagnostic addenda, emergency intake notes, medication screening, ambulance documentation, and any incident-related material tied to the original injury claim. Then I waited. 3 weeks later, a packet arrived thick enough to need both hands. I made coffee before opening it, then forgot to drink it. Most of the pages were exactly what I expected. Codes, dates, charges, adjustments. The dull machinery of American healthcare. Then, halfway through the billing detail, I found a description field beside an imaging charge that did not belong beside the story my family had been telling. Trauma Imaging Addendum External Vehicle Contact Review. I stared at it. External vehicle contact. Not weather. Not medication confusion. Not single vehicle loss of control. A second vehicle had not been erased everywhere. It had survived in the one place no one thought I would know how to read. I did not call my mother. That was the first thing I did right. The old version of me would have wanted to hear her voice change. I would have wanted to ask what external vehicle contact meant, and listen for the pause before the lie. But by then, I had learned something. People who rewrite your pain do not confess because you found one sentence. They simply rewrite around it. So I made copies. I put the original packet in a blue folder, locked it in the small fireproof box under my bed, and started looking for the hands that had touched the truth before my family did. That was how I found Nora Bellamy. Her name appeared twice in the emergency room, staffing notes, once on the triage sheet and once beside a timestamp from Trauma Bay 3. She had retired the previous spring, which meant she had no access anymore, only memory. But sometimes memory is the first door a record opens. Lancaster is small, if you know which nurses to ask, And 3 days later, I was sitting on the porch of a small white house with wind chimes beside the door and a mug of tea warming my palms. Nora was 58, narrow-shouldered, with silver hair pinned back and the tired eyes of someone who had spent years seeing people on the worst nights of their lives. She looked at my chair, then at my face, and I saw the moment she remembered me. "Subaru," she said softly. "February rain." My throat tightened before I could stop it. I told her I was trying to understand my records. I did not say cover-up. I did not say my mother. I only asked if she remembered anything from that night that did not make it into the final chart. Nora sat across from me and held her tea with both hands. For a while, the wind chimes did all the talking. "You kept saying there was a black SUV, she said finally. "Not once. Several times." The porch seemed to tilt under me. She went on carefully. "You also denied taking sedatives. I remember that because later, your family kept pushing that explanation, and it bothered me." I asked if she wrote it down. "Yes," Nora said. "Patient reports black SUV forced vehicle off East Service Road. Patient denies sedative use." Then her mouth tightened. "And I remember your mother near the nurse's station after visiting ours, asking who could amend intake language if a patient was confused." I felt my fingers lock around the mug. Nora looked toward the street. "Your attorney should request the official record," she said. "Because when I checked the chart 2 days later, that sentence was gone." Nora did not give me proof that day. She gave me something almost as important: direction. I drove home with her words sitting beside me like another passenger, heavier than the blue folder in my bag. That night, I did what Nora told me to do. I stopped trying to understand the hospital from the outside and called someone who knew how to make it answer. Rebecca Harlan's office was above a pharmacy on King Street, the kind of place with old carpet, warm lamps, and no receptionist pretending time was expensive. She was 52, with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she tapped the edge of the insurance packet with one finger. "Feelings start a case," she said. "Records carry it." By the end of that week, Rebecca had sent preservation letters to the hospital, the insurance company, Harbor House, and the garage that maintained the foundation vehicles. She requested the audit trail on my chart, the original ER intake note, the dispatch audio, and every version of the trauma imaging addendum. She used words my mother could not smooth over. Legal hold. Certified copy. Chain of custody. For 9 days, nothing happened. Then Rebecca called and told me not to come alone. The man waiting in her office was named Ellis Pritchard. He worked in hospital IT records, the kind of quiet man people overlook, because he spends his life fixing systems they only notice when they break. He kept rubbing his thumb along the seam of a manila folder. "There's an archived backup," he said. "It was not attached to the active chart." Rebecca asked him if it had been altered. Ellis looked at me, not at her. "No," he said. "That is why I came." He opened his laptop, and for the first time in 28 months, I saw the version of my accident that existed before my family touched it. The folder name was plain. Vance A. Trauma. Hold. Original. 17 pages. 3 timestamped entries. 1 dispatch audio file. 2 internal emails. 1 audit trail. The original intake note said I reported a black SUV before any family member arrived. The medication screen was negative for sedatives. The imaging addendum described side impact trauma consistent with contact from another vehicle. The dispatch audio recorded a caller, saying a black Navigator had left the East Service Road without stopping. Then Rebecca scrolled to the audit trail. 36 hours after I was admitted, someone reopened my chart under an old administrative login connected to Marjorie Vance. Below that was an email to a case manager. "Remove speculative vehicle language. Family confirms patient confusion." I looked at those words until they stopped being words and became my mother's hand over my mouth. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, administratively. Rebecca printed the file. Ellis signed a statement. I sat perfectly still because if I moved, I was afraid the room would understand before I did. My mother had not doubted me. She had overwritten me. She had overwritten me, and somehow the first thing I felt was not rage. It was clarity. Rage is loud, clarity is colder. It sits beside you in a lawyer's office, while a printer spits out 17 pages that explain why your mother could look you in the eye for 28 months and call you confused. Rebecca slid the certified copies into a white folder and told me we were not going to wave them around. Not yet. The moment they know what we have, she said, they will start explaining it before anyone official can read it. So I drove home with the file in my bag, and the strange discipline of doing nothing. But small towns do not keep secrets. Hospitals leak in whispers. Churches leak through prayer requests. By Sunday evening, my father called. Vernon never called. Unless my mother told him to, or something in the house needed fixing. His voice sounded thin, like it had traveled through several walls before reaching me. "Your mother is worried about you," he said. I looked at the white folder on my kitchen table. She should be worried about the audit trail. There was a silence so long I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "Amelia, some things are more complicated than they look." That was the closest my father had ever come to admitting he could see the shape of the lie. Callum came the next afternoon. He wore a camel coat and the expression he used in donor meetings, concerned but expensive. He did not sit until I asked him to, and even then he perched on the edge of the chair like my condo might stain him. "Harbor House is finalizing a grant," he said. 1.9 million. Memory care expansion, transportation, home safety checks, real services for real people. He let that hang between us, as if seniors in need had personally elected him innocent. I asked him what that had to do with my medical records. His jaw tightened. "If you drag the foundation into this, people get hurt." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because he had managed to make himself the victim of the road I was forced off. 2 days later, my mother arrived with chicken soup in a glass container. She set it on my counter like evidence of love. Her pearls sat perfect against her throat. "You have always needed a story to feel special," she said. I asked, very quietly, if she used her old login. For the first time, her hand went to her pearls too quickly. "Be careful," she said. "Be very careful what you accuse a mother of doing for her family." That was when I understood. The chair had never embarrassed her. The record did. The night before the Rosehaven gala, I did not stay home with the white folder. I already knew every page of it. I knew the timestamps. I knew the email. I knew the place where my mother's old login sat in the audit trail like a fingerprint she had forgotten to wipe away. Staying home would have meant staring at those pages until they became a room I could not leave. So I drove to the rehab facility where I used to work, the same building where I had once taught other people how to live after their bodies changed the rules. The night guard remembered me. His name was Mr. Alvarez, and he had been there long before my accident, always with a thermos of coffee and a paperback folded open on his desk. He did not ask many questions. He only looked at my chair, looked at my face, and said, "Therapy gym's empty." The lights were half off when I rolled in. The parallel bars stood in the center of the room, silver and still. Exercise balls lined the wall. A stack of foam blocks leaned in the corner. The place smelled like rubber mats, disinfectant, and old coffee, the same smell that used to cling to my scrubs after a long shift. I sat there for a while without moving, listening to the building breathe. I remembered Mrs. Langley, 76 years old, angry after hip surgery, refusing to use a walker because she said it made her look old. I remembered telling her that dignity was not pretending nothing had changed. Dignity was learning the new shape of your life without apologizing for it. She had glared at me for 3 days, before finally standing between those parallel bars and whispering, "Fine, but I'm doing it my way." I had loved her for that. Now I sat in the same room, with my own life folded into a legal folder across my lap, realizing I had been asking the wrong question. I had spent months wanting my mother to admit what she did. I wanted the soft version of justice, a confession, a breakdown. A mother finally choosing me in a quiet room. Rebecca had warned me about that. Do not give her a chance to rehearse the lie, she had said. So, I did not call. I did not text. I did not drive to my parents' house and demand one honest sentence from people who had built their lives around avoiding it. I opened the folder one last time, checked the copies, the case number, the timeline, and the business card tucked in the front pocket. Then I closed it. For the first time, I understood that silence did not always mean surrender. Sometimes, silence was just evidence waiting for the right room. The next evening, Rosehaven Senior Center looked softer than a place built to hold the truth. Gold lights hung across the ceiling. White tablecloths covered the folding tables. Someone had arranged lilies in glass vases along the stage, and every chair in the front row had a printed program with my mother's name centered in elegant script. Marjorie Vance, Community Caregiver of the Year. I arrived at 6:27, 3 minutes before the welcome speech, because I did not want time for anyone to pull me aside in the hallway and call it concern. I wore a navy dress, with sleeves long enough to hide the tremor in my wrists. The white folder was not with me. It was already in Rebecca's hands, exactly where it needed to be. Callum saw me first. His smile froze before he remembered people were watching. He crossed the room quickly, bending beside my chair like a man posing for kindness. "Don't do this tonight," he whispered. I looked past him at the donor tables, the board members, the ladies from church, the county reporter checking her recorder. "I'm not doing anything," I said. That was true. I had finally learned the difference between making a scene and letting one arrive. My father sat near the stage, with both hands wrapped around a glass of water. Vernon looked older than he had the week before. Not sorry, just tired in the way people look when a lie has become too heavy to hold and too late to drop. Then my mother stepped up to the microphone. She was beautiful that night. I can say that because it is true. Cream jacket, silver hair swept back, pearls at her throat. The exact face a community wants on its thank you plaques. She spoke about service, about aging with dignity, about the moral duty to care for people who cannot always care for themselves. The room nodded. People dabbed at their eyes. Then she saw me. It was only a second, a flicker, but I knew my mother's face the way some people know weather. Her smile tightened, then softened into public sadness. "Some wounds," she said, looking straight at me, "do not heal because people are not ready to stop living inside them." The room shifted, heads turned. Callum moved closer. My father looked down. I placed my hands on the rims of my chair and said nothing. My mother leaned toward the microphone again. "My daughter is not disabled," she said. "She has been using that chair to punish this family for 2 years." The silence afterward was so complete. I heard Edith Rollins set down her fork. Then, I looked at the side doors. They opened right on time. Rebecca came through first, calm in a dark suit, carrying the white folder against her chest, like it weighed more than paper. Detective Grace Mallory followed half a step behind her. She was not dramatic. No raised voice. No hand on a weapon. Just a county detective in a gray coat, looking at the room the way trained people look at rooms, noting exits, faces, tension, and the woman at the microphone whose smile had just begun to fail. My mother recovered first. Of course she did. "I'm sorry," she said, with a small laugh meant to invite the room back to her side. "This is a private family matter." Rebecca did not answer her. She walked to me and bent just enough to ask, "Do you want to proceed?" That mattered. After 28 months of people speaking over me, someone finally asked. "Yes," I said. Detective Mallory opened the folder on the nearest table. The county reporter had stopped pretending not to listen. Callum stood frozen beside the donor banner. My father's hand was still around his water glass, but now the glass was shaking. "The original emergency intake note," Detective Mallory said. "Records that Amelia Vance reported a black SUV forcing her vehicle off the East Service Road before any family member arrived at the hospital." A sound moved through the room, not loud, more like breath, leaving 84 people at once. My mother touched her pearls. "That was confusion," she said. She had been through trauma. Detective Mallory turned one page. The medication screen was negative for sedatives. Callum looked at the floor. Another page. The imaging addendum described side impact trauma consistent with contact from another vehicle. A black Lincoln Navigator assigned to Harbor House Foundation was serviced 2 days later for front passenger side damage. One of the board members stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Callum," he said, "is that true?" My brother opened his mouth, but nothing useful came out. Rebecca placed a second document on the table. The repair was paid through a discretionary outreach account. That account was approved by Mr. Vance. Now every face turned toward Callum. My mother tried one last time. "This is being twisted." "I was protecting my daughter." Detective Mallory did not look impressed. She turned to the audit trail. 36 hours after Miss Vance was admitted, the chart was reopened under an old administrative login connected to Marjorie Vance. Shortly after, the language regarding the second vehicle was removed. For the first time in my life, my mother had no sentence ready. Then Edith Rollins stood, slow and steady, one hand on the table. "I have known you 30 years, Marjorie," she said, "and that is not what a mother does to her daughter." I looked at my mother, then at the room that had finally stopped believing for her. "You kept saying I wasn't disabled," I said quietly. "You were right about one thing. I was never helpless." No one clapped after I said it. That would have made it too easy, too clean, like the end of a movie where the truth arrives wearing music. What happened instead was quieter and much harder for my family to survive. People began moving away from my mother. Not dramatically, just one small step at a time. A donor closed his checkbook. A board member took off his name tag. The reporter lowered her pen and stared at Marjorie like she was seeing the woman beneath the award. Detective Mallory asked my mother and Callum to come with her to give formal statements. She did not drag anyone out. She did not need to. Authority is sometimes loud, but that night it was just a calm woman closing a folder while my mother's whole life of careful appearances folded with it. Vernon stayed seated until everyone else had started whispering. Then he looked at me across the room, and for 1 second I saw what I had wanted to see for years. Shame. Not courage. Not protection. Just shame. It was not enough to save him, but it was enough to tell me he had always known where the edges of the lie were. The weeks after Rosehaven moved slowly, real consequences usually do. Callum was suspended from Harbor House before the weekend ended. The $1.9 million grant was frozen pending review. The foundation board ordered an audit, and the Black Navigator was taken in for examination. My mother's award disappeared from the senior center website without an announcement, just a blank space where her smiling picture had been. Rebecca filed the civil case. Detective Mallory kept calling witnesses. Nora Bellamy gave a statement. Ellis Pritchard turned over the archived records properly. Edith Rollins mailed me a card with blue flowers on the front. Inside, she had written one sentence. "A chair is not a shame, a lie is." I kept that card on my refrigerator. My father called 4 times. I answered once. He said, "I knew enough to ask questions." Then he stopped. I waited. He added, "I didn't." That was the closest he ever came to an apology. I told him I hoped silence had been worth what it cost him, and then I hung up. The settlement came months later. I will not say the number. I will only say it was enough to buy a small, accessible condo with a roll-in shower, wide doorways and windows facing a line of maple trees. Mine, this time, not rented, not temporary, not arranged around fear. I still use a wheelchair. That did not change. What changed was the story attached to it. For 28 months, I waited for my mother to admit I was telling the truth. I thought that was freedom. It wasn't. Freedom was the day I stopped needing her voice to confirm what my body, my memory, and the record already knew. The lesson I carried out of all of this was not that paperwork matters more than love. It was that love without truth becomes control. Family is supposed to be the place where your pain is safe to speak. It is supposed to be the room where, when the world doubts you, at least one person says, "I believe you." Start from the beginning. But not every family knows how to love without protecting its own image first. Sometimes the people closest to you are not afraid that you are lying. They are afraid that you are telling the truth, because the truth asks them to change. It asks them to admit what they ignored, what they allowed, what they benefited from. And some people would rather call you difficult than face the damage they helped create. For a long time, I thought healing meant getting my mother to understand. I thought if I found the right words, the right tone, the right moment, she would finally see me. But healing did not begin when she admitted anything. Healing began when I stopped handing her the power to decide whether my pain was real. That is what I hope someone takes from my story. Trust the quiet part of you that remembers. Keep the records. Write things down. Pay attention to the small details people hope you will overlook. And when someone keeps asking you to stay silent, for the family, ask yourself who that silence is really protecting. Family should never require you to erase yourself to keep the peace. Love should never make you smaller. And survival is not always loud. Sometimes survival is a folder on a kitchen table, a phone call you choose not to make, a truth you protect until the right people are ready to hear it. I did not leave that night with the family I wanted. I left with something I needed more. My own life back. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had someone twist the truth and expect you to carry the blame? Have you ever had to choose peace over people who refuse to change? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that their truth still matters.